Ray Cutler opened the drain gate on a Tuesday morning in late March. The water started moving slowly. It slid through the rusted gate first in a narrow sheet, then spread across the low ground below the dam, brown at the edges where the first silt lifted and turned. The pond had been there since 1931. It had dropped in dry summers and risen in wet springs and sat behind the old hay barn long enough that nobody in Montour County thought of it as something a man could question. It was the water on the Hessler place. That was what every neighbor had told Ray before he bought it. The pond watered the cattle. The pond made the farm usable. The pond was the reason the place still had any value at all. So when Vernon Staley came across the field and saw the gate open, he did not walk. He nearly trotted. He stopped at the dam and looked at the falling water. Then he looked at Ray. "You just killed the only water on that farm," Vernon said. Ray watched the pond for a moment. "Maybe," he said. That was all he said, because he could not explain the thing he was testing without draining the thing everyone else trusted. The pond was not the source. It was the lid. By that afternoon, word had reached the hardware store in Tipton. A man buying feed, said the new owner, out at the old Hessler place, had opened his pond gate and let the water run out into the ditch. Somebody said he was going to fill it in. Somebody else said he'd bought a cattle farm and drowned his own cattle water before he'd run a single cow on it. Ray did not hear any of that firsthand. He was still standing at the dam, watching the level fall an inch at a time. Ray Cutler had bought the Hessler place in January of 1983. 280 acres in Montour County, Missouri, the kind of ground that had been in one family long enough that people stopped thinking of it as land for sale. The Hesslers had held it since 1908. Ernst Hessler had worked it until he died in 1979, and his two sons had neither the money nor the interest to keep it going. The cropland went to cash rent. The hay ground grew up in broomsedge and sericea. The fence came down in more places than anybody bothered to count. And the pond, the one thing everybody still pointed to when they talked about the place, silted in at the north end until cattails stood chest-high over ground that used to hold 2 feet of open water. The pond covered close to 2 acres of open water, with another acre of shallow silt flat behind it where the cattails had taken hold. Near the concrete headwall at the dam, it still ran 7 feet deep. At the north end, a man could push a probe rod through 18 inches of water and hit soft silt that wouldn't hold a calf, let alone a cow. Every neighbor who talked to Ray about the farm said the same thing in different words. The pond was the water. There was a domestic well at the house, but nothing else for livestock. If the pond ever failed, the Hessler place couldn't carry cattle at all. It was 1983, and money in Montour County had gotten tight in a way that made everybody more careful, not less. Interest rates were still high enough to keep a man up at night, and farms changed hands more often than anyone liked to talk about at the coffee counter, usually because a family had run out of options rather than because they'd found a better one. Ray had bought the Hessler place at a price that reflected what it was, a neglected farm with a fence that needed rebuilding, cropland rented out to somebody else, and a pond everybody assumed was the only thing keeping the ground worth anything at all. He didn't have room in his operating budget for a mistake. If he drained the pond and there was nothing behind it, he wouldn't just lose water. He'd lose the ability to run cattle on 280 acres he'd already committed to paying for. Ray believed that, too, until November of 1982, a few months before he closed on the sale. He found Cleet Mosby through the county extension office, an old list of names from a 4-H committee that hadn't met in years. Cleet was 71, and he'd worked the Hessler place as hired man from 1948 to 1971, 23 years under Ernst Hessler. Ray drove out one afternoon and sat with him at his kitchen table for 2 hours. Cleet didn't talk like a man who had a secret. He talked slow and plain, the way old farmhands do when they're trying to get a fact right instead of trying to make a story. Before that pond was ever built, Cleet said, farm didn't need it. There was a spring up on the north slope below the old woodlot, came right out of the sandstone up there. Ran year-round, near as I ever saw. He said the original settlers, German families who'd worked that ground before the Hesslers had built a stone box around the spring sometime in the 1890s. A 2-inch clay pipe ran from the box down to a stock tank near the barn, about 600 feet, all on gravity. Pond went in, 1931, Cleet said. After that, nobody paid the spring much mind. But I remember 54, dry as it's ever been around here. Pond dropped to nothing at the deep end, and that spring was still running when I checked it just to see. Ray asked him where, exactly, and Cleet pointed him toward the edge of the old woodlot on the north slope, above the pond. He didn't give Ray a map. He gave him something better on an old farm, a reason to walk uphill. Ray walked that slope before he ever signed anything. Near the edge of the woodlot, along an old fence line grown over with saplings, he found a flat limestone slab about 3 feet square, half buried under leaves and years of leaf mold. He worked a pry bar under one edge and lifted it. Underneath was a stone and mortar box, roughly 3 feet deep and 2 feet wide, built into the hillside. The bottom held 6 inches of silt and old leaf litter. At the base of the north wall, where the natural sandstone met the built stone, there was no standing water. But there was a dark, wet stain on the rock, the kind of stain that doesn't dry out even in a dry month. It was not water yet, but it was not dry either. On a neglected farm, that was enough to keep thinking. Ray put the slab back the way he found it. He didn't mention it to the seller. He went home and sat with the number for 3 weeks before he made an offer. The pond looked like security. It also looked like a bill. Dredging it back to a working depth would run about $4,800, and in 15 or 20 years, it would silt back in and need dredging again. That was the arithmetic of a pond. It never stopped costing money. It just spread the cost out over decades. A spring, if it was real, didn't work that way. It didn't lose water to evaporation the way 2 acres of open surface did in July. It didn't silt in from bank erosion. It moved by gravity, and gravity didn't send a bill every 20 years. Ray priced it out before he ever cleared a shovelful of dirt. A hydraulic ram pump installed ran $840. A 2,500-gallon poly holding tank was $620. Pipe and fittings came to another $440. If the old clay line under the pond had failed, replacing it with poly pipe would cost roughly $900. All told, restoring a working spring system would cost him around $2,800, less than dredging the pond once, and it wouldn't need dredging again in 20 years. He wasn't choosing between a pond and a spring. He was choosing between a bill that came back and a system that, if it still worked, would keep working on its own. In February and early March, Ray cleared the brush off the north slope and started cleaning the stone box. He used a trowel, not a spade, because he didn't want to break into the sandstone behind it and change whatever had kept that seam damp for 90 years. He worked the silt and leaf debris out a little at a time. Within 2 days of getting down to bare stone, the moisture at the base of the north wall had visibly increased. By the end of the week, a thin sheet of water was moving across the stone floor of the box. 10 days in, water stood 4 inches deep. He measured it the only way a man measures water on a farm without a meter, a 5-gallon bucket and a watch, 2 gallons in 6 minutes. Call it 20 gallons an hour, roughly 480 gallons a day. It was not enough water to impress a banker. It was enough water to question a pond. Ray did not tell Vernon Staley about any of it. He didn't tell the men at the hardware store either. He went back to the dam in late March and opened the drain gate. Nobody in Tipton believed there was a reason for it. A man who'd bought a rundown farm with one working pond had just let that pond start running out into the ditch. Vernon crossed the field before the water had dropped 6 inches, said his piece, and Ray gave him one word back. The pond dropped over the following week. Nothing about it looked planned from the road, but up on the north slope, the stone box was behaving differently. As the pond surface fell below the old outlet elevation, the flow through the stone box picked up. It wasn't complicated once you thought about it plainly. The pond had been backing water up against that hillside for 50 years, pushing back against the spring the same way a closed valve pushes back against a pump. Lower the pond, and the hill could move water again. By the end of the second week, Ray's bucket test showed 1 gallon a minute, 1,440 gallons a day. Vernon saw the pond dropping further and took it as proof he'd been right all along. The talk at the hardware store didn't slow down. "New owners ruining the Hessler pond," somebody said. "Man's going to fill it in and lose the only water that farms ever had." Ray didn't answer any of it. He kept writing flow numbers in a notebook. Then, in the third week, the pond bottom moved. The deep end still held about 18 inches of water near the concrete headwall. But at the north end, where the silt flat used to sit under standing water, Ray noticed a slight channel forming in the mud, a low spot cutting itself deeper by the day. It wasn't dramatic. He watched it for 2 days before he understood what he was looking at. Something was pushing water up from underneath the silt, separate from the spring on the hillside above. He dug into it carefully with a spade. 14 inches down, the spade hit clay pipe running north to south under the old pond basin. He worked along it by hand for 6 feet in each direction before it disappeared into undisturbed silt on both ends. The pond had not only covered the old water, it had buried the evidence of how the farm used to move it. Ray let the pond drain another week until the basin was firm enough to walk across in most places. He rented a hand auger from an equipment dealer in Versailles and probed the slope north of the basin, following the elevation where he guessed the old line would run. 40 feet out from the pond edge, the auger caught clay tile at 18 inches. He dug down by hand. One end of the tile was capped, not with the kind of cap a farmer improvises out of whatever's lying around, but with a lead plug, deliberate and old. Somebody, back around 1931, had shut that line off on purpose and built the pond dam right over the downstream end of it. Ray worked the plug loose. It did not explode from the ground. It did not roar. It simply started running, the way water does when it has been waiting a long time for someone to remove the one thing stopping it. 3 gallons in 90 seconds, 2 gallons a minute. 2,880 gallons a day, out of a line that had been sealed shut for 52 years. Between the stone box on the hillside and the tile line under the old pond, Ray now had more than 4,300 gallons a day of gravity-fed water, moving through a system that had been buried, quite literally, under the thing everyone believed was the farm's only water. He cleaned and releveled the stone box and put a proper cap back on it. He ran 620 feet of 3/4-inch polypipe at 38 cents a foot down to the stock tank site near the barn, the same 600 feet Cleet had described from memory. He tied the uncapped tile line into the same run with a Y fitting and a valve so he could manage the two sources separately. Below the confluence point, he set a small hydraulic ram pump on the slope, clicking steadily, lifting around 180 gallons a day up to a holding tank on the high ground above the 40-acre field. It was not enough water to irrigate a crop. Ray never claimed it was. It was enough to fill a stock tank on gravity alone, with a little left over for the high ground when it mattered most. Vernon came back around when he saw the pipe work and the smaller, deeper pond Ray had reshaped out of what was left of the old basin. He still wasn't convinced. "That pond held water 50 years, he said. Ray walked him up to the stone box and let him watch the water moving clean across the floor, then down to the stock tank, filling steady with no pump running at all. "That was under the pond the whole time?" Vernon asked. "Not under it," Ray said, "behind it." He didn't say anything else, and Vernon didn't argue with what he was looking at. Ray kept flow records through that first year, along with receipts for the pipe, the ram pump, the tank, and a rough sketch Cleet had helped him draw of where the old line used to run. When he sat down with a lender the following spring, the Hessler place wasn't just an old farm with a played-out pond anymore. It was 280 acres with a documented, gravity-fed water system, a restored spring box, a working tile line, and grazing capacity that didn't depend on rainfall the way the pond alone ever had. Nobody handed Ray a fortune for it. The place didn't triple in value overnight, but the borrowing base moved, because for the first time in decades, there was a record of where the water actually came from, instead of just a pond everyone assumed would always be there. A year later, Vernon mentioned that his own pond, over on his home place, had started silting up the same way the Hessler pond had. It had been dug sometime before Vernon's father bought the ground, and like most men in that county, Vernon had never once asked what the farm had used for water before that pond went in. He asked Ray if he thought there might be something behind his, too. Ray didn't promise him anything. He'd learned by then that a wet stain on a rock didn't mean the same thing on every farm, and that Clete Mosby's memory of the Hessler place couldn't tell him a single thing about Vernon's. But he also knew that most men who'd farmed a piece of ground for 30 or 40 years had never once climbed the highest point on it, just to see where the water used to run before somebody decided a dam was easier. "Find the oldest man who worked it," he said, "then walk uphill." Vernon did exactly that winter, tracking down a man in his 80s who'd hired out on that ground back before the war, and by spring he had his own flat rock pried up on a slope he'd walked past 1,000 times without looking twice. After that, men in that part of Montague County stopped asking only how deep a pond was. They started asking what had fed it before anybody built the dam. Vernon had thought Ray drained the Hessler pond because he didn't understand water. But Ray had drained it because he understood something the farm had forgotten. The pond had been there since 1931. The spring had been there long before that. The pond was never the source. It was only the lid. If stories about forgotten farms, old wells, hidden springs, and the quiet wisdom of rural land mean something to you, subscribe to Old Farm Wells and tell us where you're watching from. The bank saw a silted pond. Ray saw a lid over 50 years of water. Would you have drained the only pond on your farm on a hunch and a wet stain on a rock?